You're being selfish." My son stood up from the table so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood, his napkin still balled in his fist. Half a second later, his wife picked up her wine glass and threw it straight at my face. Glass shattered above my eyebrow, blood ran into my collar, and the whole table went dead silent. And here's the part none of them understood. I smiled. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and drove myself to the emergency room. Because what nobody at that table knew was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for almost 3 months. My name is Arthur Kessler. I'm 68 years old. I taught high school history in Pittsburgh for 31 years, and this is the story of the Easter dinner that ended one chapter of my life and started a much better one. I live on Sycamore Lane in Squirrel Hill, in the house my wife Helen and I bought back in 1989, back when our son Brian was still in diapers. Helen passed 4 years ago from breast cancer, and since then the house has felt too big, too quiet. Brian is 34 now, married to Ashley for 5 years, with 2 kids, Lily, 6, and Sam, 4. The 2 upstairs bedrooms that used to belong to Brian and his sister sit mostly empty these days, except when the grandkids stay over. I never thought much about those rooms, not until a few months ago, when the comments started. Ashley's parents, Gary and Linda Prescott, had lost their house outside Monroeville about 8 months earlier after a bad investment, and they'd been living in an extended stay motel ever since. I felt for them, I did. But underneath that sympathy, something else had started growing. A quiet suspicion that got louder every time Ashley looked around my living room like she was measuring it for furniture that wasn't hers. About 2 months before Easter, I sat down with my lawyer, Nathan Reyes, the man who'd helped me update my will after Helen died, and I told him what I'd been noticing. Nathan didn't tell me I was being paranoid. He told me to keep my eyes open, document everything, and call him the moment something crossed a line. We even joked about it, called it Phase 1, just in case. I laughed when he said that. I had no idea how soon I'd need it. 2 weeks before Easter, Brian called me, sounding a little too cheerful, the same fake cheerful voice he used as a teenager, right before asking for money. "Dad, since everyone's off work, maybe Gary and Linda could come too. Get to know them better as family." I said that sounded fine. It did sound fine. What I didn't know was that Brian had already talked to Ashley the night before about using the dinner, the family setting, to make it harder for me to say no to something bigger. I spent the week before Easter cleaning the house, buying a ham too big for the crowd, pulling out Helen's good china. I wanted that Sunday to feel normal again. I had no idea that by dessert, I'd be bleeding on my own kitchen floor instead. Easter came in warm and bright. Brian, Ashley, and the kids arrived first. Gary and Linda pulled in 20 minutes later in a rental car. Their own had been repossessed months back, something Ashley mentioned a little too loudly while carrying in a bag of dinner rolls. For a while, it actually felt like a normal holiday. Linda complimented the china. Gary talked about the pirates. I remember thinking maybe I'd been reading too much into things. Dinner started around 2. Ham, mashed potatoes, green beans. Halfway through, Ashley set her fork down and looked slowly around the dining room, the same way she'd been looking at my living room for months. "This house is just so lovely, Arthur. All this space, and it's just you here most of the time, isn't it?" I agreed it was a big house for one person. Brian glanced at her across the table. Gary cleared his throat and changed the subject to the Steelers. I didn't understand yet that it was a deliberate deflection. Dessert hadn't even come out when Ashley set her wine glass down harder than necessary. "Arthur, my parents are really struggling. You have 2 whole bedrooms sitting empty upstairs. I just think it makes sense for them to move in here for a little while, until they get back on their feet." The table went quiet, except for the kids laughing in the other room. I set my fork down and told her I appreciated that Gary and Linda were struggling. I meant that. But my house was my home, not a solution to someone else's housing problem, and I wasn't comfortable turning my guest rooms into a permanent arrangement for people I barely knew. Ashley's polite mask slipped off fast. "It's not permanent. It's just until they save up. And those rooms just sit there collecting dust, while my parents sleep in a motel off Route 22. Brian jumped in, trying to sound reasonable, and landing somewhere closer to pleading. "Dad, come on, they're family too." I looked at my son and told him, as calmly as I could, that it was still my house, my decision, and the answer was no. Gary and Linda looked mortified. Linda stared at her plate. Gary shifted like he wanted to vanish. I don't think they'd asked for this fight. But Ashley wasn't finished. Brian shot up from his chair so fast it screeched against the floor, pointing a finger at me the way I used to point one at him at 16. "You're being selfish," he said, loud enough that the kids went quiet in the next room. "This whole house just for you, and you can't help family who actually need it." I told him to lower his voice. There were children in the house. But he kept going. Ashley chimed in right behind him. "You have empty bedrooms, Arthur. Rooms just sitting there while my parents suffer. And you won't even consider it." I stayed seated. I stayed calm. 31 years of teaching teenagers how to argue had taught me that raising my voice back would only make it worse. I told them both, evenly, that this conversation was over. My home was not up for negotiation at my own dinner table. That was when Ashley picked up her wine glass and threw it across the table, straight at me. It caught me above the right eyebrow and shattered, and I felt the sting a half second before I saw the blood. Warm, fast, running down my face and onto Helen's white tablecloth. The room went dead silent, except for Lily's small voice from the other room, asking what happened. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Ashley's hand still hung in the air. Brian stood frozen, going pale at the sight of blood dripping onto the table. Gary and Linda pushed back their chairs, Linda's hand over her mouth. I touched the cut, looked at the blood on my fingers, and I smiled. Small, calm, because in that exact moment, everything I'd quietly prepared for over the last 2 months had just become necessary. I no longer had to wonder if I'd been overreacting. "Dad," Brian said, his voice cracking. "Are you okay? I'm so sorry. She didn't mean." I held up a hand to stop him. I stood, walked to the hallway closet, grabbed my jacket and keys, pressed a folded dish towel to my forehead. "Where are you going?" Brian called, somewhere between panic and confusion. I told him I was going to the hospital, and that he should stay and take care of his family and his guests. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone out loud. I just walked out my front door, while my son stood frozen in the doorway, still holding his napkin, still not understanding what he'd just started. The drive to Allegheny General took 11 minutes, and I remember every one of them. At a red light on Butler Street, I pulled out my phone and typed 4 words to Nathan Reyes. "Phase 1 is complete." That wasn't some dramatic movie code. 2 months earlier, after noticing the pattern of comments about my house, I'd asked Nathan what my options were if things ever escalated. He told me plainly that guilt-tripping and pressure, ugly as they are, don't hold up legally. But if something ever turned physical, even something that seemed small, like an object thrown, that was a different matter entirely, one with real legal weight. We agreed that if that day ever came, my first step, before calling anyone, was to get to a hospital and have the injury documented, because medical records made in the moment carry a kind of honesty that memory and argument never do. Phase 1 was never about revenge for its own sake. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't take back, there'd be an honest record starting the moment it happened. At the ER, a nurse named Denise had me in a treatment room within 10 minutes. Dr. Whitfield examined the cut, 1.5 inches, needing 6 or 7 stitches, and asked routine questions as she worked, including whether I felt safe at home. I told her honestly. My daughter-in-law had thrown a wine glass at me during an argument at Easter dinner. Her expression barely changed, but I could tell she'd heard versions of this story before. She explained, gently, that hospital policy required her to notify law enforcement in cases like mine, and that an officer would want to speak with me before I left. I told her that was fine. Some part of me had already expected it. About 20 minutes after she finished stitching, Officer Daniels walked in, notepad ready. I walked him through the whole evening, the request about Gary and Linda, my refusal, the shouting, and Ashley throwing the glass directly at my face in front of everyone, including her own parents and my grandchildren in the next room. He asked careful questions. Where I was sitting, how far away Ashley had been, whether it looked intentional or accidental. I told him honestly it looked deliberate. She'd picked the glass up, aimed, and thrown it. He nodded and told me it would be filed as simple assault, and that he'd be following up with Ashley for her account. My phone kept buzzing in my pocket the whole time, Brian's name lighting up the screen over and over. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say yet. That same evening, Officers went to Brian and Ashley's house to get her side, as procedure requires. I heard later, partly from Brian, partly from Nathan, that Ashley tried to claim it was an accident, that the glass had slipped from her hand while she was gesturing. The problem was that 4 other adults at that table had already told the officer otherwise. Gary, Linda, even Brian, all confirmed she'd thrown it, not dropped it. Officer Daniels told her plainly that the injury, the eyewitness accounts, and the fact the glass had traveled across the table didn't support an accidental story, and that the report would move forward as assault. I'm told Ashley cried through most of it. Brian, from what he told me later, stood in the kitchen barely speaking, trying to process how one argument about house guests had turned into police officers in his living room on Easter Sunday. Over the next several days, my phone rang constantly. I let most of it go to voicemail while I focused on healing and meeting with Nathan to figure out what came next, because Phase 1 had always just been the beginning. Sitting in his office about a week later, we talked through my options. I had no interest in dragging this out for years or punishing anyone beyond what the law decided was fair. But I was done being treated like a housing solution by people who were supposed to love me. Nathan suggested 2 things. First, a temporary protective order, giving both households some legally enforced distance while the assault charge worked through the courts. Second, and this mattered more to me personally, restructuring my estate so my house and savings would go directly into a trust for Lily and Sam's education, administered by Nathan, not Brian or Ashley, with me keeping full control while I was alive. This wasn't about punishing my grandchildren or cutting Brian out forever. It was about making sure nobody could ever again treat my home or my safety as something up for negotiation over dinner. Nathan filed the paperwork within the week, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was back in control of my own life. About 2 weeks after Easter, against Nathan's advice and my own better judgment, I let Brian and Ashley come by to talk. My stitches were out by then, leaving a thin pink line above my eyebrow. Ashley looked like she hadn't slept. Brian looked worse. They sat stiffly on my couch while I sat across from them in Helen's old reading chair. Ashley apologized first, voice shaking, saying she never meant to hurt me, that she'd just been overwhelmed watching her parents struggle, and it came out sideways at the worst moment. I told her I believed she regretted it, but regret didn't erase what happened, and throwing something hard enough to draw blood was never an acceptable way to handle disagreement. Brian asked if I could talk to the DA and make the charge go away. I told him plainly that this was no longer mine to control. The state was handling it now, and Ashley would face whatever the process decided, the same as anyone else. I also told them about the trust for Lily and Sam. Not a punishment, just me protecting my home and my money for my grandchildren's future, instead of leaving it as something to be fought over at family dinners. Brian went quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor, and I could see something shift behind his eyes. Ashley's court date came 10 weeks later. First offense, no record. The DA offered a plea deal instead of a trial. She pleaded guilty to simple assault, 60 hours of community service, a modest fine, 6 months of mandatory anger management, and the protective order staying active the same period. No dramatic courtroom scene, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened. I spent that afternoon in my garden instead of the courtroom. My written statement had already said what needed saying. Word got around the neighborhood, the way it always does in Squirrel Hill. My neighbor Carol brought over a casserole just to check on me. An old teaching colleague called. Nobody made me feel foolish for calling the police, for involving the courts. That meant more than I expected. Gary and Linda, through a senior housing assistance program Nathan actually helped connect them with, found a modest 1-bedroom apartment near Monroeville a few months later. Something within their actual budget, something that never needed to involve my guest rooms at all. By late summer, Brian and I had started, slowly, to find a new normal. He reached out on his own, without Ashley, more than once, asking for lunch. Just the 2 of us. He apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything disappear. He admitted he'd let Ashley's frustration about her parents pull him into pressuring me, in a way he wasn't proud of, and that watching me bleed at my own table had made the ugliness of that pressure impossible to ignore. I told him I still loved him, but trust would need to rebuild slowly, through actions, not a single conversation. Ashley and I spoke exactly once more after the court proceedings ended. She thanked me, awkwardly, for not pushing the DA toward a harsher outcome. I told her honestly I hoped the counseling helped, and that someday we might sit at a table together again, without either of us flinching, but that some doors take longer to open, especially the ones that got slammed shut so hard. I started seeing Lily and Sam again on a regular schedule, usually just Brian bringing them by on Saturdays, and slowly the upstairs bedrooms filled back up with the sound of board games and blanket forts. Exactly what those rooms were always meant for. It's been almost a year now. My life looks different, quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The scar above my eyebrow is barely visible unless you know exactly where to look, though I catch Brian's eyes drifting there sometimes, like he's remembering something he'd rather forget. The trust for Lily and Sam is still in place, still fully under my control while I'm here to use it. I've made peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold. It was responsible, exactly what Helen would have wanted. I planted a bigger garden this spring, tomatoes and peppers, the kind Helen used to grow every summer. Some Saturdays Lily helps me water it while Sam chases the neighbor's cat around the yard. Brian and I are rebuilding something real, slower than either of us would like, but real, brick by brick, instead of pretending everything's fine the way we used to. I never went looking for revenge that Easter Sunday. Not really, not in the way people usually mean it. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own safety, and my own choices, to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them the most. And sometimes, protecting yourself calmly, honestly, and legally is the only kind of revenge that actually lasts.